Welcome back for the third segment today of Dateline New Haven. Thanks for hanging with us, folks. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, there's a lot to talk about these days at the New Haven Police Department. The whole country's talking about the New Haven Police Department. So it's time to roll back in the policing expert for WNHH, John Velleca, the former chief of the department and chief of another department, and he's a professor in criminal justice at Albertus Magnus and the sergeant at arms at the state senate. John Velleca, thanks for coming in and making time.
No, anytime.
So, John, you know, obviously the big story these days is Richard Randy Cox, 36-year-old man in New Haven. He was arrested on a weapons charge at a Lilac Street party, and he was arrested without incident. Actually, I was watching the video. There's a lot of video of this. It's a pretty chill. I thought the officers handled very well the way they arrested him, and he handled it well. But there was some conflict at some point. But he got put in a transport van with no seatbelts. Right. The driver, we don't know why, at the last second slammed on the brakes. This individual's body was thrown and his head slammed against the metal wall. He injured his spine and neck, couldn't move part of his body. And then a whole series of events happened that have become controversial. Right. Instead of waiting, when the driver stopped and checked him out, instead of waiting there, took Mr. Cox to the 1 Union Avenue Police Detention Facility. At that point, they didn't believe him that he couldn't move, so they threw him around. They put him in a wheelchair. They dragged him on the floor. Right. And this kept going on, and they put him in a cell and threw him on the ground, and then they cuffed his feet. The guy couldn't even move. Right. So now we think this is going to be tens of millions of dollars. It's going to cost the city. The guy's on a breathing tube and an eating tube. We don't know what the rest of his life is going to be like. He's paralyzed. Big protest planned this week. Big civil lawsuit. 5 cops in detention. I mean, on leave while the state is investigating this incident. What do you make of all this, John Velleca?
Well, I mean, you look at this holistically at the national level. It's obviously the same as what we've been saying. We have, in policing, unfortunately, we have devalued black and brown people with the way we police in their communities. And that hasn't changed. No matter, you may have, top police executives telling you all about the changes we've been making in policing, but that's not one of them. We haven't made that change, and we need to. The other end of it is more local.
There's some black and Latino officers we should mention.
Right, but let me get to that too. So more localized, Paul. When you talk about New Haven PD, what we see a lot in New Haven is a lot of blunders, so to speak. That could have, rudimentary stuff that we should know how to do, and the officers are just not doing it, and the supervisors are not holding them accountable, and then the upper command is not holding the supervisors accountable. So it's a trickle down effect. But right, when you start to talk about, hiring black and Latino officers to put them in these positions, to alleviate this kind of stuff, you have to understand that they're entering a culture that has been around for decades now. Now, you could have the most well-intentioned black officer going in and then fall prey to the culture that exists.
Well, what's the culture issue? Everyone's been talking about culture.
Well, the culture of policing is simply, we have to value black and brown lives.
That's the national point. You said there's also an issue here, and that's a really important point.
The issue here
about not following basic procedures.
Right. And the issue here in New Haven, I think, is more of that than it is.
And what is that issue?
The issue is not knowing your basic policies and procedures, not following them, and then not being held accountable for not following them.
And why is that culture here in New Haven?
Because I think we've had a mass exodus of veteran officers. Right, veteran supervisors as well. So we've promoted a lot of people into pretty prominent positions where they're making big decisions, and they may not be ready to make those decisions, to be quite honest with you. And just poor supervising. Listen, we all watched the video, right? If I was driving the truck, if you were driving, Harry was driving the truck, anybody, you would see that that was a hard hit he took, right? The first thing you should say, forget about what your responsibility is. How about as a human being? I got to stop here because that was pretty bad.
But he did.
But the thing is, would you have moved that guy watching that video, how bad it was? Like, we watch it, we cringe when we watch it, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing, I would have felt, listen, I got to get this guy help immediately.
Now, one issue was, so he stopped on College Street. He looked at the guy, he heard he couldn't move.
Right.
When I watched that video, the officer, Oscar Diaz, did sound concerned. And he called for medical help, and he decided to meet the medical help at detention rather than stay there. So one thing I don't have clear is procedure that he's supposed to stay there, because if you move a person with a spinal neck injury, that there's further, they'd be further injured. Because some people are saying this is you learn in Boy Scouts. I didn't know this. But everyone's telling me any EMT, any Boy Scout knows that
Not to
if
move
so,
him.
not to move anyone
Right.
who's got. So the act of taking him from college to one union, was that a form of moving him because he get hit again?
Right.
There's
So
no seatbelt.
So back up just a little bit. And here in New Haven, we're not medically trained. We are trained at an MRT level in the police academy, and it's never renewed or certified. So it's the MRT. It's a medical response technician. It's the lowest certification you can have, and we don't renew it in our in-service. So we are not medical responders. But the truth of the matter is, yes, common sense would tell you not to move somebody.
Should we be EMT trained, or is
No.
that not realistic?
I don't think it's we don't need to, because what we have, the hospitals are so very close to every part of the city, and
so
our
would
fire
it have
department
mattered
does a
here
very
if
good.
we renewed the training? Would they have known not to move him? Would MRT training have told them don't move a person with a
MRT
spinal
would,
injury?
sure, they would have reinforced that, but I don't think you can say I moved him because I didn't have this MRT training, because I do believe what you were saying is true too. It's common sense.
Well,
right?
I didn't know this, but everyone else tells me they know it. Yeah.
With a neck injury like that, sure. The real issue I have with Diaz, and I don't know him at all. Is
Supposed
that,
to be a very good officer.
right, and that's what I've heard too. That's what I've read. We're on College Street. Okay, so if you're watching that video and you see the injury he sustained, and you're real in your heart, what you're trying to do is get this guy medical attention initially. Well, the hospital is closer than detention. So if you're going to drive anywhere, why aren't you driving right to the hospital? Why?
What's procedure on that? He's not supposed to wait for the ambulance crew to handle it as a medical technician?
I got to be honest with you, I don't think that's mentioned in the policy at all about what you do in this situation. I think this is where we kind of rely on common sense, And, if you're sitting there and you're driving the wagon and you say to yourself, listen, I got to get this guy medical attention, right? Well, why not go a block away to the hospital? Why is it so important to get him into detention processed? And so, whether he was taking that seriously or not, I'm not saying he wasn't taking it seriously, but it should have been at a very higher level of, I think he should have worried much more about getting him medical attention than getting him down to.
Gotcha. And then that's phase one, John Velleca. The part that blows everybody away even more
Right.
is what happened when he gets to detention. That just seemed to change, including Officer Diaz.
Yeah.
What he
yeah.
says, he's got questions. So you have 5 cops there, and they're telling the guy he's lying. They're saying you can move.
Right.
They're yelling at him, stand up. They're putting him in a wheelchair. They're moving his body. They're dragging his body into the processing room in the cell. First of all, where was the ambulance crew? Why did it take so long?
Well, I don't. That would have. You have to ask Amar. That
But
it
second of
usually
all-
doesn't. They're usually there waiting for us when we need them.
So that's weird, but why did they drag him into a cell?
I have to tell you, what happened in detention is egregious on a lot of different levels. We just talked about one of the officers who, he seemed like he was, he had the best intentions out on the road. It was simply an accident when he stopped, but then his attitude changes when he gets down into detention, right? So there's that culture taking over, right? So you can be the best officer, you could be a minority officer, you can be,
Right.
the best officer. But once you get within that police culture, it's going to change how you act, and it's going to dictate what you say and what you do. And that's,
So what happened with the culture there when there were 5 of them and there was a supervisor saying he was lying?
well, I could tell what I would say if and this is speculation. If I were one of the officers there, I would say, well, the boss is here, right? And I'm going to follow what the boss's lead because, kind of a CYA thing. Whatever they tell me to do, I'm going to do because I don't want to get in trouble.
So
The boss is
what
here.
happened when you watched that video? How was the tone set of the culture?
The culture was there was no value put on this guy. Nobody really cared. It didn't seem as if, I shouldn't say nobody because I don't want to speak for them. It didn't seem like it was exigent, right? It didn't seem like, I don't know how you look at that video, okay? And then when this guy gets down and says, I can't move, you say, well, that's because you're drunk. Now, the reality of the situation is maybe he was drinking, but before that, he was very active. Whether he was kicking the doors or not, he was still very active. He was vocal, right? And then he took this hit, and everything stopped. He's not talking. He's not moving. He's not kicking the door anymore. He's not doing any of that. That all lends to the fact that this is a serious injury, right? And we should have handled it as that. And it shouldn't have been fluffed off as, oh, you're drunk. But at the end of the day, Paul, if he's drunk and he's getting over on you, who cares? Call for medical anyway. What's the difference whether you call for medical or
So
whether
what
you
was
don't?
going on? Why did this happen? Why did the supervisor set that tone?
I tell you, I would have to get that from her, to be honest. That's why when I initially commented about that, I said, let's hold off and see what they say, because I'm sure that's one of the questions that's going to be asked. Why didn't you do this? Why? What were you thinking?
I'm surprised there was a criminal inquiry, I have to admit. I didn't realize that these things now routinely become criminal inquiries. The state's attorney is looking where there's a crime. Is there any... Catherine Vieira says because they're dumb AF. Thanks for listening, Catherine. Was it the norm that you have criminal inquiries in these cases? And would anyone besides the supervisor be criminally liable for this?
I would have to really take a good look at that, and that would be something that the investigation would...
But IA, do you think they're all going to be fired, or just the supervisor fired and the others suspended, retrained?
I honestly... I think somebody's going to lose their job over this. I think so, to be honest with you.
Well, the supervisor had a previous case where someone died because she wasn't following procedures in the lockup.
Right. But don't forget, she's also got a little bit more than the officer, because she could also take a demotion for punishment as well. But yeah, I think this is to the level where, these are somebody in here, when we figure out exactly what would happen, we don't want this ever to happen again. And I don't know how you, it's a common sense thing. So I don't know how you send this to retraining. I don't know how, if somebody doesn't have the, know what to do in this situation, I really don't think they should be a police officer, to be honest. That's my personal opinion. So if I were the chief, I would put somebody up for it.
What would you be doing now if you were the chief?
If I were the chief and I didn't get real good answers about what happened in detention, I would probably be putting a few people up for termination.
A few?
Yeah. Huh. And I don't want to name, but when I watched that, there were a few people that don't really have a place in policing, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, that's not, we all make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. That's something that says, not to say I was perfect as a police officer, far from it. However, there are certain things where, what do we say all the time? Well, it's only a few bad apples. Well, there are some professions where you can't afford a few bad apples, right? Like we said before, if Delta said, listen, 90% of our pilots are great at landing, the other 10% are not so good, you're probably not going to fly Delta, right? So, this is kind of the thing where everybody has to be on par with these kinds of incidents at least,
Yeah. Catherine says they should be held personally liable, or tax dollars shouldn't pay for officers not following protocols. And Greta Boudreau says, will their insurance pay? John Velleca, our criminal justice expert, professor, sergeant at arms, former chief in New Haven. John, in addition to these individuals whom will be dealt with, what about policy-wise and protocols? Martin Looney has a proposed law he's going to reintroduce that would require immediate emergency medical service to an individual who experiences a health emergency while in police custody. Marty feels this law would have saved this guy. What do you think?
Well, I think that exists already within our policies. Anybody who has a medical attention is supposed to get immediate attention. And a medical problem is supposed to get immediate attention. As soon as you ask for... right? And that goes back to the fact that we are not EMTs. We're police officers. So if Paul Bass comes in and says, listen, I need a doctor. I need to go to the hospital. We are really not at liberty to say, no, you don't, right? We're supposed to just provide that service. So would that bill have, I'm not sure if it would have made a lot of difference in this. Part of that bill I would like to have somebody on site, staff on site. You know what I mean? That would be a different story.
So is part of your feeling that detention should have an EMT on site?
I would like to see, and this was back, when I was there, when we were talking about turning over the detention facility or keeping it, and that was a big discussion.
Right, the state used to run it, then they cut money to have us pay to do it.
Right. And that was one of the things that I was always lobbying for. Like, if we're going to take it, we need medical staff on hand at all times for everybody. If an officer was to be hurt down there, if somebody were to come in, and in other words, there are a lot of arrestees that will come in and feign an injury to go to the hospital, right?
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that we, as police officers, we don't have that training to discern whether they're lying or whether they're not. Right. So it would be nice to have somebody on site.
What about how about in general? Has there been a problem with how detention is run?
Well, detention has never been a well-oiled machine, so to speak.
Was it run better by the state or no?
It was. I think. I don't have any experience about running it ourselves because I was gone by then. But I would think that if you took a battery of personnel that are down there now who are trained to be police officers, as opposed to people who are trained to be correctional officers and work within these facilities, you would have to give the edge to the state, the correctional officers, right? Because they're trained to do this specifically. Whereas we're just kind of, I don't want to say winging it, but we're down there doing the best we can.
So was it a mistake to turn it over to the cops?
Absolutely. I agree with that, yeah.
Would you put it back?
I would, if I were the chief, the very first thing I would look to do is try and get that off our hands, 100%. Yeah.
So that happened after you left that got over?
Yeah, under Esserman.
Okay. The other thing I heard was that, so you were gone by 2015 when the Freddie Gray incident happened in Baltimore, where he got a deliberate rough ride and he died.
Yep.
And I'm told that in New Haven, the chief said, because of Freddie Gray, I want seatbelts in the transport vans and cameras so that we don't have this. And that they got the cameras, but only one got the seatbelt. Why did that happen?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I've never seen seatbelts in the van. I've always had like it is outfitted now, where you hold the strap in the back. And
why was that?
Well, we said in the comments that we tried to get away from that, and it was because expecting the officer to go deep into the van to seatbelt somebody in would expose him and
so
put
there
his
was a
safety at
conscious
risk.
reason not to do it, because they did put him in one of them.
Right, they put him in one. That was after. That's the I believe that's the newest one. Because what we were trying to do was figure out whether we should keep these vans or not. Right, because it'd probably be easier to transport. The problem was that was taking officers out of service for a very long time. So you have me and you were say we were to arrest somebody. We put somebody in your car, then we go down and bring them in, and we do all the booking paperwork. So, but the two of us as officers are out of our beat, out of our area, out of service for a number of hours now. Whereas we turn them over to detention. Once we do that, we go right back into service, and we can start taking calls again.
And Camille Ennis-Rainey says, thanks everyone for listening and posting comments, says, unfortunately, the tax-paying citizens in New Haven will be financially responsible for the indifferent behavior of these 5 officers. If you had to guess how much this is going to cost the city?
It depends on how good their attorneys are, to be honest. It also depends on a few things, whether Cox actually makes a recovery. I mean, if he doesn't make a recovery, there's, you're probably in 7 figures, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
At least. Freddie Gray was, $6.5 million, and he died. Mm-hmm. And that was an intentional rough ride. That will play into it, too. The big difference here is there's a video of this. It's very egregious. That it's very difficult to watch on many different levels. There wasn't one in Freddie Gray, right? And that'll be very inflammatory if it were to go to trial.
Mm-hmm. We're talking to John Velleca about the case with Richard Randy Cox. And what do you think happens now with the department? This is very tough for the officers. I know how bad the police feel anytime anything this happens, and how much the community feels, and it's going to be big protest marches. What do you think is in store next?
The department is in for some rough times, and I'll tell you why. One, the DOJ, I'm sure, is looking at this. And if they start heading towards the consent decree, that's a very big issue for us.
You really think this is going to be a consent decree? Because it wasn't intentional. Think of what it took for a consent decree for East Haven, where they were deliberately inventing and planting evidence and beating people up.
Right. So you can have a consent decree in a couple of different things. One, if you have isolated incidents that are intentional, or if you have a band of incidents that dictate a culture of this stuff going on.
Okay, so you think there's a culture.
So if they were to look at that and go back the last 4 or 5 years and look at these instances, right, and they determined that there was a culture here where...
Do you think can you think of instances in the past?
Yeah.
I guess there was the case we wrote about where a guy died in lockup.
Guy died in lockup. I mean, he had the officer who kicked the guy in the groin who was on the ground.
That was in lockup?
No, that was on the street. He lost his job.
Yeah.
You had... Whether or not I agreed with everything in it, but you had the incident down on Mr. Marshall on Long Wharf.
Oh, yeah. Well,
right?
you and I feel very differently about that one, John. We often agree. I think that was our Derek Chauvin case, and luckily a young policewoman saved us from that by interceding, and then got no support from the department for stopping a guy from pounding a guy in the head.
And even the parts that we disagree on, we don't disagree with the deportment of the officers. And I think that's the bigger thing, is that when I was in internal affairs, over 90% of our cases were with regard to officers' deportment, how officers are speaking, how they're acting, what they're saying. And they're usually fluffed off, right? But those officers' deportment issues become these issues after a few years, right? That officer who is pulling you over and admonishing you roadside becomes the officer who drags you out of the van into the cell and handcuffs you, if he's not stopped, right? He or she's not stopped. And I think that's...
So you're saying, given that this pattern of cases might lead to the Federal Department of Justice investigation and perhaps a consent decree?
Well, I think, I don't want to speculate. I don't know that for sure. But I know that if they were to look at how do we correct the problems in the New England Police Department, it's not our policies, because our policies are very tight, are very good. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we have great policies on paper, but they're not being followed. Mm. So the Department of Justice is going to ask themselves or ask us the question, look, how are you going to change that? And if not, we're going to do that for you. And if they start doing that for us, then that's going to cost us a lot more than the lawsuit's going to cost us. You know?
We're talking to John Velleca, the criminal justice expert of WNHH-FM, and about what's going on with the police department. Why do you think Sergeant Segee was still permitted to oversee the detention center when she had been disciplined and lost some days, I guess 5 days of work after a guy killed himself because her people weren't making the rounds, and she really wasn't apologetic about that and said, I just trust them to make the rounds. Why do you think she was kept in charge?
Well, I think that that's not a desirable assignment, right? And I think that if you were to start switching somebody into that assignment because somebody has dropped the ball, the first thing that would be said was, well, I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to screw up so I get out of here, The other thing is, I think Jacobson hit the nail on the head last week when he said, complacency was a great word, but we'll talk about that another way. But I think that he said we discipline and we move on. And that's a great point. He makes a good point. We do. We discipline and we move on. We don't necessarily correct the problem, right? We discipline and then we move on. And for some reason, we expect the problem to be corrected. And we're seeing in this instance that obviously the problem wasn't corrected. And I'm sure there are other instances, too, where the same officer who may have been disciplined for something is committing the same type of actions in the future, right? And really, like Jacobson said, discipline, retrain, mentorship, but then eventually, if you're not correcting the behavior, then it's time for you to seek work elsewhere.
John Velleca, you mentioned Carl Jacobson. He's in line to be voted on tonight by the board of alders. The betting money is he'll be easily chosen as new police chief. How do you feel about that?
I think right now that's the best thing they can do. They don't want to add, the alders don't want to add to this by creating now dissension among the chief. I think Carl can do a good job. I think he's got his work cut out for him. I think he's doing this without a lot of support, right? He needs some real quality assistant chiefs, and we can't play the game of who's color and what. At this point, you just need to put people in here who know how to do the job and get this department back in shape, get on its feet. And I think that's what they should do. And I think Carl's committed for the long term, which is the bigger thing to me. I think that he's willing to stay, maybe 5-8 years, whereas, the revolving door of chiefs doesn't help us. It kills us. It hurts us. That's probably the worst thing that's happened over there, because each chief comes in with a different set of priorities, right? And a different definition of, our old term, community policing, right? Everybody thinks everybody's got a different definition, right? You could, everybody's got something different, and they put in different initiatives, and there's a lot that can be done, though. And, it's just a matter of whether you have the backbone to do it. I think Carl does.
All right, so you think it's a good move to have someone who you think is committed for the long term? And is it also because he comes out of the department, or is that relevant?
I'm sorry?
Is it also a plus that he comes from within the ranks, or does that not matter?
I think it's, I was never a big believer in that. I think that when you get to the chief's level, you got to put the best person for the job, whether they're from the outside or from the inside. But I do think it helps him because he knows the lay of the land. He knows the officers, right? He knows who may be a problematic officer but not have the documented history behind him being a problematic officer, so to speak, and that's a big deal. But he's going to have to change the culture there. He's going to have to do it without a lot of help. He's going into contract negotiations, which is a huge deal.
Right. That's not close. And when's the contract run out? Has it already run out?
I think they're going to start negotiations this year. Are they not? Right?
Yeah. It's this season, I think it runs out.
Yeah. So, he's got a full plate. And then he's got a community now that he's put himself out there to, that he's going to be out there, and this is not a town where you can hide. I
kind of feel like everyone's very upset about the Cox case, understandably. I'm not feeling the same anger at the department that I often hear. I feel like the department didn't present itself as against the community on this. They kind of came clean. It was terrible. And they came clean from day one, and they didn't seem to be taking... the first press conference, the acting chief started talking about how this guy was a felon. It turns out 18 years ago, and he was 17, and almost like blaming him for the thing. But then Carl Jacobson stepped forward and said, this isn't about his past. When you're in our care, we're responsible. This should never happen. And I think that was a tone that got set.
That was a great thing, and I spoke to him about it. I think he's doing a great job. Difference between, and nothing against the acting chief, the difference between state police and municipal police, right? The difference between knowing your commitment to your community and not so much knowing your commitment to the community. I think They got those videos out there quick.
They did, and
Right.
also they answered all our questions even before the video. I haven't seen that happen for years.
And the one thing I said to Carl that I thought was great was that nobody was afraid to say this is a terrible thing, and people are
Yeah.
going to pay the price for this. We didn't circle the wagons on this one. We told you, look,
Yeah.
we're going to do an investigation, and you know, there's going to be problems here for whoever is caught that being negligent, things like that. You know.
So now, since Cox is another case people are talking about that that happened this past weekend in Akron, Ohio.
Right,
This
so,
one
yeah.
I've been talking about. This one I'm having really. And Camille and this Randy says that's interesting. They're disciplined, but the problem is not corrected. So it continues. Thank you, Camille. So Jaylon Walker, 25 years old, was shot 60. He was
Yeah, I
hit,
saw
right?
that,
Not just
yeah.
shot. Wasn't he hit 61
Hit
times?
61. Well, he was hit 61 times, but we question that sometimes only because some of those could be entry and exit. You know what I mean?
So even
So-
over 30. I mean, that's
Yeah,
like
sure.
a picture you have on a wall when you're shooting at a target.
Yeah, yeah.
He didn't have a gun on him, but there was a gun in the car.
Right.
It was a routine traffic stop. It was not a felony stop. He wasn't doing
I thought he
anything.
had the gun out. Didn't he have somebody seen with the gun outside of the car or
They're
something?
claiming
like that?
that's a little unclear, and they thought they
Okay.
might have seen a flash. But
I
he's
seen
running,
something like that, yeah.
But he wasn't stopped for a gun. He was stopped because, what was it, like some kind of traffic?
Right. Right.
So
And
what
then-
was that?
Well, it was a traffic stop, but then didn't they get the information during that he had a gun or something like that? That's what I thought I
He
read.
started running.
Right.
He didn't have the gun on him when he's running. He's running away, and officers shot up to 61 bullets
Yeah,
into
that's a
him.
problem. That's a problem
And
for everybody.
one guy even had time to reload. Because, we saw this in the Hampton case where I understand, John, this is what I want to ask you about. I understand that, if I'm not mistaken, that if you're a police officer and you feel you're being shot at, which these people were not, but if you feel in danger, the response is to respond with a lot of bullets because you don't want to get killed. Sometimes police officers will say it's not fair to count the bullets because if we're getting shot at, you have to shoot a lot
Oh,
back.
no. That's
But
complete
here
bullshit.
they weren't being
That's-
shot at.
That's nonsense. We count the bullets. The bullets are a big deal. You're never trained to dump all your rounds down on a target.
So how did this happen?
Because it's sheer recklessness. I mean, we call it. There's a phenomenon we call sympathetic fire. In other words, if you and I are together and you start to fire at somebody, I will just start to fire in that direction as well. Feeling that you've identified the threat and this is what I need to do. That's not acceptable. That's wrong. You're not supposed to do.
And
stuff
that's
like
what
that.
they did in Akron, right?
Right.
One person starts shooting, they all start shooting, even reloading.
And you're certainly not supposed to shoot as much as you want because you want to lay down cover fire, whatever the hell that means. We had it was it 2010, I think it was, downtown shooting. I remember I interviewed the officer, and the
So
officer
College Street? No.
College Street, exactly. And the officer believed that she fired twice. Well, she ended up firing 13 times. So the thing is, some of these things you see, they're so in the moment that these officers don't even intentionally do this, but they do it. Now, somebody running away from you who you're sighting up, it looks like, in other words, you're taking your time, long story short, and you shoot that many times, I mean, that's an issue. That's a problem. What is your intention? That's the thing, is our intention should always be to save, if we're using deadly force, right, save our lives or the life of a third person. So, they teach us, fire once, evaluate the threat. If the threat still exists, fire again, right? Take cover, fire again. You're never taught to empty your magazine in the down range at its target, just so you don't get shot. That's nonsense, And for an officer to say, "Well, it's not fair of you to count that's nonsense too. If you can't listen, you're a trained police officer. Okay, if you can't control yourself in the most important situations, in other words, when you're using your firearm, when can you control yourself, right? In all honesty, if you can't control yourself firing at a person, when can you control yourself?
So what kind of moment are we in now? Is this just like any other moment? Policing has always had some things that go off the rails, and now we find out about them more and people are said, or is there kind of a problem now with under-trained police officers not following rules that more experienced officers would follow?
I think that, the other day I read a study from Pew Research from 2020, and they asked a question to white police officers, and they said, what would you say the relationship, how would you rate the relationship between your police department and the black community? 92% of them said excellent. 92% said excellent, right?
Wow. They're not out in the community.
My point is, that's the culture that has to be permeated that has not been permeated yet. And as officers out there, you're going to get a lot of people that think that we've already made all the changes we need. We don't have to do anything else, right? And now we're going to be fair to black people from this point forward because the changes are in place. And outside of that, we've been pretty good to them anyway. Now, unless you start having the real situation where black people and brown people are getting the shit end of the stick from the criminal justice system, if you can't sit there as a police officer, police administrator especially, and acknowledge that, we're going nowhere.
Okay, and that's what I want to take back to before I let you go, John. And thank you so much for coming in.
Anytime.
John Velleca, when we mentioned earlier, you said that you felt that there were two cultural issues at play here, if I'm not mistaken. One is the national issue of devaluing black and brown people by police, and then a second issue you think in New Haven,
right,
where we have good policies, but just continual blunders and no one held accountable.
Yes.
What about the fact that all the officers were black and brown here who mistreated Mr. Cox? Is that relevant?
No, I don't think it is. Like I said to you before, you could add as many black and brown officers to the police department as you want. If your culture is still one where you're not following the rules and you're doing whatever you want, and you have devalued a certain group of people, then you're gonna fall prey. You're gonna be susceptible to that culture. Eventually, that culture is gonna get you. You're working in it every single day. You're gonna adopt those ways of thinking, or like what we would see, a lot of the black and brown officers who come in and see that kind of culture, they leave, Paul. They leave. They quit the job, and they realize that they can't change it, and they're going to go. They're just going to take up another profession. And that's why I say I think Carl will do good, because Carl understands that. He understands that the first step of this is acknowledging how we treat the black and brown community, because if we don't, we can't fix it, right?
Well, every time Stephen Solasky says, I worried for the NHPD in the 70s under Chief Ahern, and the department got away with so much. That's a long story. Thank you, Stephen.
That's a different time.
I'm hoping that John Velleca, you'll continue to come back to help us parse that
anytime.
story.
Yeah,
So it's always great having you on Dateline New Haven.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Harry Droz for rolling with 3 segments today on Dateline New Haven, and thanks for these great comments you wrote in. Tough time right now.
Yeah,
I think we're going to hope we get through it. You've gotten through them before.
Yeah.
John Velleca, thanks for showing up. Harry Droz, thanks for working the controls, and thanks for the comments. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.